This is the last talk, but just a brief reflection on the fact that I'm really impressed by the range of talks that we've had today in terms of subject, in terms of geographical spread across Norfolk. So what better place to end than to bring us back to Norwich, okay? And we're going to look at law and order in the stranger communities in Norfolk towns. In the depths of the storerooms in the British Library in London is a manuscript which, the cover tells us, was saved from the fire, although it does not tell us which fire, nor in which year. The manuscript is more than 400 years old, and so here and there, small creatures may have taken a bite of it, and water may have made a few words illegible. Nevertheless, most of the manuscript can still be read, though written in a 17th century hand, which presents the transcriber, i.e. me, with significant challenges. It has the reference code AD MS 43862. For our purposes, it is of interest as it is a minute book of the meetings of the political men, Dutch politica manna, French homme politique. They were officials in the Flemish and Walloon stranger communities in Norwich. They were charged with hearing and passing judgment on petty offences, financial disputes between parties, and cases involving orphans and guardianship. I begin this final paper of today's conference by discussing how the office of political men emerged and evolved in Norwich. I then discuss the sources available for studying their activities, including the manuscript in the British Library, before analysing what we know of the strangers who held this office. After a word about the use of language, we'll see how time is going in the minute books, I examine some of the cases that came before the political men. These not only tell us about the work of these officials, but provide us with insights into the deeds and misdeeds of strangers who knew whom and how order was kept within the stranger communities and between the strangers and the local English population. By 1568, some 1,400 Dutch or Flemish strangers and a smaller number of Walloons, 339, had arrived in Norwich. Norwich's population in 1565 was around 10,000, so they already made up some 15 to 20% of the population. Whilst the strangers provided an economic boost to the city, they also presented a challenge to the civic authorities. In 1567, the mayor of Norwich, Thomas Wale, declared that he had no liking for the strangers, and even argued that they should be thrown out or avoided from the city. The alderman prevented Wale from realising this ambition. He was probably a crypto-Catholic, which may have contributed to his view. Nevertheless, his successor, Thomas Parker, also recognised the challenges that this sudden increase in stranger numbers represented. And so the role of political men was introduced in Norwich during his mayoralty. Oops, sorry. How did that get? Okay. An entry in the Dutch and Walloon Strangers Book, 1564 to 1643, provides the necessary details. This is a transcription by the city archivist Frederick Johnson. It reads as follows. The time of Mr. Thomas Parker, Mayor, an ordinance made for the aliens, strangers, there's that word already, item that out of your whole company ye shall elect and name to the mayor for the time being 8 persons, parsons, for the Dutch congregation, and 4 for the Walloons, that shall be governors to the whole company, and shall take upon them the charge and answering for such as shall be found remiss and negligent in performing the articles afore for strangers specified, or any article or order hereafter thought meet and necessary to be kept and observed. It continues, and those 8 and 4 persons shall yearly be presented to the mayor for the time being within 7 days after the mayor shall have taken his charge. And if any of the 8 and 4 shall fortune to depart, either out of this city, or else shall die, that then within 7 days after this, after his or their departure of this city or their death, The residue of the 8 and 4 shall, in the name of the whole company, present unto the mayor the name and names of him or them so elected and chosen anew. A couple of points are in order here. First, this tells us that the strangers elected each year to be political men had to be approved by the mayor. This was in contrast to the other officials who helped to keep order amongst the strangers, the elders and deacons, with whom they formed the 3 colleges of the stranger communities. Broadly speaking, the elders and deacons, working alongside ministers, were responsible for ecclesiastical matters such as cases of alleged adultery, the spiritual well-being of their community, care for the poor, and church finances, whilst the political men were responsible for civil matters such as petty offences, financial disputes, and guardianship. Nevertheless, they worked closely together. For example, in the mid-1570s, along with the elders and deacons, they devised orders which were subsequently included in the Book of Orders to regulate the Dutch textile workers. I mentioned that this morning. Furthermore, letters from the Norwich Dutch community were often sent in the name of the 3 colleges. Second, the entry in the Stranger's Book stipulates that 8 Dutch and 4 Walloons should be elected each year. Whilst this order was probably adhered to in the early years, in the Minute Book for 1605 to 15, the one in the British Library, more than 4 Walloons are listed. For example, in the entries that we see here on the right, for the 1st of July and the 8th of July 1606, there are 8 and 6 Walloons respectively. And on the left, 7 Dutchmen for each occasion. Why this discrepancy emerged would require further investigation. The German historian Reingard Esser, who has written a monograph on the strangers, describes the institution as a system of devolved crime control, which formed part of a strategy of shared authority between urban magistrates and leaders of refugee communities to tackle conflict and crime amongst the aliens and between newcomers and natives. Andrew Spicer, who has written extensively on the Southampton exile community, refers to the quasi-magisterial role of the political men. To some extent, the men performed the duties of the court's leet in the English judicial system or the mayor's court in Norwich. Most of the work of the political men seems to have focused on the weekly meetings, typically held on Saturdays, at which they heard cases, probably in the guild hall. There was also a bailiff in the stranger community, who was, in theory at least, a physical presence on the streets. He would round up unruly strangers or report their actions to the political men. One advantage of this approach to justice was that cases could be heard in the stranger's language. The vetting and confirmation of their election by the mayor added safeguards to this process. In the 1605 to 15 Minute Book, at the start of each mayoral year, except for the year 1610-11, the articles governing procedure for the political men were recorded. In 1606, 6 rules were listed. In 1607, the same 6 rules were listed with a couple of additions. One addition was that none of the political men should blab or spread gossip about the proceedings of the political men's meetings. And I may not be able to, let's just see here. Word clapping, there we go. Okay, clapping. Just blab or gossip. Okay, so none of that, thank you very much. Okay, yes, this might suggest, of course, that they'd been letting their tongues wag. Anyone doing that would be fined 2 shillings. Another addition stated that anyone who fell asleep during the meetings would be fined 2pence. These articles in Dutch were signed by the Dutch political men. Hopefully, I won't need to impose a similar fine during this presentation. As for sources, the Minute Book of the meetings of the political men between 1605 and 1615 was previously owned by the Anglican priest and antiquarian, the Reverend Charles Harold Evans White, FSA. And that kind of answers Joel's question this morning. He presented it to the British Library in 1935. It has 181 folio pages and 2 extra pages, which are the remains of old vellum covers. It is written in several hands, Entries from before July 1612 being by Peter Weinut Ramus, and those after July 1612 by Johannes Coccelius. In June of each year, there is an entry marking the change of mayor. The new mayor would confirm the election of the political men. One other minute book survives, which I mentioned this morning. This is preserved here at the Norfolk Record Office and has the reference code MC189/1. It comprises 4 unbound gatherings, foliated 2 to 49, with folio 1 torn away. It covers the political men's activities between April 1583 and July 1590, with additions and notes 1591 to 1600. In contrast to the later book, many of the entries in MC 1891 concern orphans. Clearly, life expectancy was shorter than today, and there were several plagues in early modern Norwich, which killed many of the strangers. Many of the entries are in French, as we see here in the top half of folio 19 recto. I'll turn to the question of language shortly. In due course, I shall transcribe and publish this document, he hopes. Another source of information about the political men's actions is correspondence between them and colleagues in other stranger communities in England. This was published, and I mentioned it before the break, at the end of the 19th century by Johannes Hessels. Some letters were signed jointly with Norwich stranger church elders and deacons. In June 1597, Jan Crusoe, the father of John Crusoe, was one of 2 church elders who signed a letter written on behalf of the elders, deacons, and political men in the Dutch community. The letter thanked the London Dutch Church Consistory for raising money for the poor of the Norwich Dutch community. Other letters were signed only by the political men. One letter to the consistory of the Dutch Church in London in 1574, signed by one of the political men, Jan Ruitink, whom we met this morning, on behalf of his fellow political men, warned the London Church not to send any more strangers to Norwich, as their numbers far exceeded the numbers permitted by Queen Elizabeth I, which, as we will remember, was 30 masters plus household, maximum 10 per household, 300. By now, there were several thousand migrants, strangers in Norwich. Let's see. Okay. Over time, the number of political men from each community diminished. The list of members of the Dutch Church, which indicated who was eligible to partake of the Lord's Supper on Sunday the 22nd of July and 14th of October 1677, mentions 4 political men. Here we go. Orders for the Dutch congregation subscribed at the foot by successive mayors from 1744 to 1759 refers to simply the politique. So that office is still being used at that time, the mid-18th century, but no further details are given, so we don't know how many political men there were. That's also preserved here at the NRO. The minute book of the Walloon Church Consistory gives the name of elders and deacons elected annually. By contrast, it only occasionally mentions the Walloon hommes politiques elected for each year, together with the names of their predecessors. By the second half of the 17th century, there were only 3 hommes politiques, one of whom was chosen as a bailiff. There we go. Okay. Yes, their leader. For example, on the 13th of June, 1672, the rather wonderfully named Charles Empereur was elected bailiff, and Jan Dumoulin and Jan Fromeau as hommes politiques. And just an aside, it's interesting, they're not Jean Dumoulin. It's Jan, was that Jean? We don't know, but the spelling of the name, again, varies from what one might expect. An entry in 1723 indicates that there was still a bailiff and 2 political men. Many political men came from the upper social ranks of the stranger communities. Jan Ruitink is a particularly interesting individual. He had been the secretary to the Council of Flanders in Ghent before being forced into exile. In Norwich, he worked as a notary, and ran a boarding school. His son Simeon studied at Cambridge and Leiden before becoming minister of the Dutch Church in London from 1601 to 1621. And his son, Jan, became minister of the Dutch Church in Yarmouth later on. Adriaan Vallerwijn, who also served as a political man, was a member of one of the leading stranger merchant families in Norwich. Francis Boy, who was a political man in 1615, was also a schoolmaster in the Dutch stranger community. He probably taught Dutch, but possibly also French. As one might expect, the clerks were well educated. The first clerk, Pieter Wynut, was the stepson of Joost de Raam. In his will made in 1577, de Raam bequeathed a silver goblet, all his garments, and books as well Latin as Dutch to Wynut. In the same year, 1577, Wynut matriculated as a pensioner at Corpus Christi, Cambridge. He is listed as Peter Ramus, Ramus being a Latinized version of his stepfather's surname. The second clerk, Johannes Coccelius in Latin, is recorded as John Coccela, often in the records, and he, like Francis Boy, was a schoolmaster. Now, I'll just go briefly across the next few slides to get to some cases. In this, I'm talking a little bit about language here, and I like to sort of spot some Latin. So the text here is in French, and then Wynut signs it as Politicorum Virorum Scriba, the clerk of the political men. So they've even developed a Latin version of this term, political men. Okay, and then we see some examples of code switching as well, switching between languages. So here the clerk has written in the margin, Thuis van Jan Gauthier, okay, the house of John Jan Gauthier in Dutch, and then the main text is in French. And there's quite a lot of switching. There's even switching into English as well for things like bills of sale. So I'm studying the language that was used in stranger records, and often it's Dutch, sometimes it's French. There's also some Latin as well as some English. And Jan Gauthier, one would expect Jean Gauthier sounds like a French surname. Okay. Let's move on. Okay, now I want to look at a few cases that came before the political men to get a sense of the type of work they did and how they dealt with these cases. The cases often involve financial disputes or guardianship, but also accusations of calumny and one case of fraud. They offer a window into the lives of the strangers and little tidbits of information that add colour to what we know about them. The nature of financial disputes varied. Some were disputes around agreements that, according to the plaintiffs, had been broken. In 1611, a work-related dispute between Johan van Hecke and Simon Doon came before the political men. The men decided that Doon should stick to his agreement with Van Hecke and either employ him for a year or give him 2 weeks' wages and pay his expenses. The political men often came up with different solutions to address specific cases and deal with the financial situation of each person who appeared before them. In one case, in 1605, Jan Catella and Jacques Legrain Jr., themselves both political men, brought a case against Charles Gringol, seeking 3 shillings and 8p plus costs. The minutes do not record why the defendant, Gringol, owed the money. However, they do tell us that he acknowledged his debt and offered to pay 6p a week until the debt was settled. There were 12p and a shilling, so it would have taken 7 to 8 weeks to pay off this debt. The political men reviewed the case and decided that the defendant should immediately pay a deposit, the amount of which the plaintiffs would have to agree to, and then settle the outstanding debt within 3 weeks. Now on to this slide. In 1605-6, Adriaan Vallerwijn bequeathed to Jan or John Crusoe £4, quite a decent sum in those days, and to every one of the children of John Crusoe, including John Crusoe, 20 shillings sterling. In 1606-7, Jan appeared twice before the political men in relation to the Vallerwijns. On the 3rd of February, he appeared on behalf of Mrs. Vallavine and was permitted to avoid any payment. No further details are given. Later that year, he appeared as the defendant to answer a complaint made by Daniel Vallavine Jr. The minutes record that the political men ordered Jan, to pay Daniel £4. It may be a coincidence, but this matches the amount that Jan had been bequeathed by Adrian Vallavine. The amounts of money varied considerably. Some financial cases involved relatively small amounts of money. One such case, which was heard on the 28th of April 1607, involved Jan Obert and Peter de Vos. Obert, the plaintiff, demanded 2 shillings from de Vos, the defendant, which he claimed de Vos had borrowed from his mother. De Vos responded that he had never received any money from Obert. Clearly, further deliberations took place, and the men decided that Obert's claim against de Vos was baseless, and that he should speak to his mother again on the matter and return if there was still a case to answer. At the same meeting, Jan Vasseur brought a case against Jan Hameau, seeking the same sum, 2 shillings, for board and lodgings, or bread, butter and rent, brood, boter, in the huishuren in Dutch. Hameau had been summoned 3 times, but failed to appear. That happens quite often in these records. The men declared that he should pay the amount immediately with costs. There is nothing new under the sun. In other cases, however, the amounts of money involved were quite large. £1 in 1600 would be worth about £200 in today's money. In 1606, Bastiaan van Buren came before the political men to claim that the widow of Johannes van Straasele owed him £6 or £1,200 in today's money. She responded that this was a great calumny. The men adjudged that he should bring them evidence of the debt so that they could judge the case fairly. In the same year, 1606, Marie Duval appeared before the men, making a claim for wool to the value of £14, 11 shillings and 5 pence. This would be nearly £3,000 in modern money. The defendant, Jasper Bureer, responded by saying that he owed wool to the value of £12, 8 shillings and 3 pence. The political men therefore needed to pass judgment on the difference of £2, 3 shillings and 2 pence. The minutes throw up unusual cases. On the 20th of October 1607, Margret, the widow of Jan Vicard, brought a case against Jan Lengelaar. She demanded a letter and a pot of conserve, as well as costs. The defendant said that he had already delivered 2 pots of conserve to the plaintiff and argued that he had delivered all the conserve that he had received from his supplier in Calais. No more details are given about this intriguing story of cross-channel conserve supply. Other cases do not involve financial disputes. In 1611, Jacques Engelbart and Peter Holnut accused each other of calumny. Having examined the case, the political men ordered Holnut to pay a fine and costs. The Dutch term used for calumny, lekkerage, is unusual and does not appear in the authoritative Dutch dictionary, Het Woordenboek der Nederlandse Taal. Several cases involve strangers walking around during a religious service. In October 1606, the bailiff reported that Abraham Piron and Elisaiah de Horne had been walking around during the sermon. The political men ordered them to pay a fine. Whilst minute books can occasionally be a little dry, they often throw up some local colour or give unexpected insights into local life. A case heard on 18th of November 1606 involved 2 men called Jan Martin as plaintiff and defendant. To distinguish between them, the clerk named the plaintiff Jan Martin fait tout, i.e. Jan Martin does everything, and the defendant, Jan Martin fait rien, Jan Martin does nothing. Perhaps these were commonly used nicknames for the men. In the case, does everything sought 5 shillings because he had hired a worker from does nothing, and this worker owed does everything 5 shillings. The political man upheld the complaint and ordered does nothing to pay, does everything the 5 shillings plus cost. I kid you not, that's what I said. It's, some really fun, interesting cases come up. And local place names are sometimes mentioned to give local colour. In one case, a stranger called Everard had heard merchants talking in de Platze van St. Joris op Toomland, the area of St. George's Toomland, Joris being the Dutch for George. In another case, Jacques Le Rouge had overheard a conversation in 't Witte Paard, a pub, one of many in Norwich, called the White Horse. I've looked for this pub. It doesn't seem to exist anymore, but if anyone knows of a white horse from the 17th century, please do let me know. A little earlier, I mentioned Jan Crusoe. In 1608, something happened, which would no doubt dent his reputation as a cloth merchant and church elder in the Dutch stranger community. On the 8th of September, an extraordinary meeting of the political men was convened, to which Crusoe was summoned. He was accused of falsifying seals. This, it was argued, would not only harm his reputation, but also that of the stranger community. Indeed, one can only imagine what the reaction of the civic authorities would have been if they had got wind of this case. A similar case in the Dutch bay-making community in Colchester in 1581 had led local church leaders to comment that those who counterfeited seals in the Low Countries would have been condemned to the gallows. So it is not surprising that the political men ordered that the matter be kept quiet, no clappen. The clerk, Peter Weinert, recorded the case. And in this case, this is obviously the Dutch text, and here we see the name of Jan Crusoe. Okay, and I've translated the key parts into English. And they read as follows. The political men have found that Jan Crusoe has committed an offence against the trading community and harmed it significantly by attaching say seals to send the same, i.e. the says, to London. Wanting to protect the honour of the community and attempting to resolve all these matters quietly and properly, the governors and the political men have finally decided to make good the situation. Jan Crusoe shall first hand over to the governors of the same say trade all the counterfeit seals that he had made for this purpose. Crusoe was given a fine of £5 and 15 shillings, over £1,000 in today's money. The minute book records that 3 months later, on the 8th of November 1608, Crusoe had paid this fine. Before concluding, I briefly want to mention the other stranger communities in Norfolk. I've not yet found evidence for political men in King's Lynn. There was a stranger community in King's Lynn. In the records, there is mention of deacons, elders, and ministers, but not of political men, although I don't rule out the possibility. By contrast, we have letters which provide evidence for political men in Thetford and Great Yarmouth. The stranger communities in both towns were established in about 1570. In 1580, the consistory of the Dutch community in Thetford wrote to its London counterpart that one of the community's members, Pasquier Clarabout, had asked the town's mayor to hold an election for political men without the knowledge of the consistory, which had up to then always elected the political men. The members of the consistory were clearly not happy about this. Clarabout had previously been a member of the Norwich Dutch Church and had caused trouble there. The Thetford community was quite a small weaving community founded in about 1570, as I say. It was probably an offshoot of the Norwich community, which started because there was a huge disagreement in the Norwich community about whether resistance to the Spanish in the Low Countries should be armed or not. And eventually, all three ministers in Norwich were thrown out, and then within a year, one of them turns up as the minister of the Thetford Church. As for Yarmouth, a letter dated 9th of September 1593 from the consistory of the town's Dutch Church refers to elections being held after the Sunday sermon. The first election was to be held for de Manor, which is likely to refer to the Politica Manor, who were elected annually. In this slide, we see a plaque on a surviving wall of the Dutch chapel in Yarmouth. This is on the same street that we've got the wonderful modern library on the other side of the road. And the other blue plaque here, if I can zoom in, Okay, as you can see, I go around taking photos of blue plaques. This commemorates a fleet from Yarmouth that defeated French and Genoese forces at the Battle of Sluis in 1340, another link between Norfolk and the Low Countries. Oops. Concluding, Weingart Esser argues that the office of political men in Norwich provided a template for dealing with civil matters in stranger communities, not only in Norfolk, but elsewhere in England, such as Canterbury and Sandwich in Kent and Halstead in Essex. There were politicans in Dutch colonies, such as Taiwan, although whether these were based on the Norwich model would require further investigation. Nevertheless, from the available evidence, the political men in Norwich clearly played an important role in resolving disputes between members of the town's Dutch and French stranger communities and formed an important component in maintaining urban stability in early modern Norwich. Although they wanted to keep the case of Jan Crusoe within the community, they did hand over responsibility for other cases that they could not resolve to the English judicial system. The fact that the mayor would vet political men adds to the sense that they allowed for a system of devolved crime control, to return to Esser's formulation. Furthermore, the fact that political men administered justice for at least 160 years, although their number diminished over time, illustrates that the institution, which began on an ad hoc basis to cope with the sudden influx of migrants from the Low Countries, was successful and furthermore provided a template for similar institutions elsewhere in Norfolk and further afield. Finally, if Esser is right that Norwich provided, the Norwich system provided a template for other towns, this adds yet another first to the fine city of Norwich. And finally, just in case it might have slipped your mind, I thought I'd throw in that. Thank you.